always limited. But this adolescent onset group is never as violent as those early starters. Even if they get snared and don't kind of mature out of it in their 20s, they never have as much violence as those kids who started early. And remember that life course persistent group? A lot of these kids, the longer they followed, yeah, they were hell on wheels at 3 and 5, most of the crime in their teens, but some of them in their 20s actually stopped. So that would be an example of resilience. They're trying to figure out what predicts why a small set of this 5% of boys really does tend to stop their antisocial behavior. So what's one of the lessons here? People over the last 75 years have said, well, we've got to figure out a way to categorize antisocial behavior. It's overt versus covert, aggressive versus non-aggressive. It turns out that, did you start these behaviors before you were 10? Kind of like Moffat's early starter group? Or did you not start until 11, 12, 13, adolescent? That's maybe the biggest dividing line you can have. So the DSM has maintained within conduct disorder, do you have a child onset versus an adolescent onset variety? Because the child onset group tends to be the rare group with a lot of problems. The adolescent onset group tends to do a lot of antisocial behavior, but never terribly violent, and tends to, on average, mature out of it. What is true of this early onset group, the child onset conduct disorder in the DSM? They had insecure attachments at a high rate. They had difficult temperament. They showed, even in the preschool years, poor planning on tests of executive functioning and control. Lots of family disharmony and coercion. They didn't do too well on verbal IQ tests. Maybe they can't think their way out of a situation where they feel cornered. Lots of peer rejection, 1st and 3rd grade. So in the early onset group, this is developmental psychopathology squared. All sorts of risk factors, multiple levels of analysis tend to come together. And again, the adolescent onset group, they've got their problems. It's no picnic to almost go to juvenile hall when you're 15, but they didn't tend to have all these early risk factors that would make you think they've got a mental disorder. So what about boys and girls? Can you tell a boy and girl, let's say you are looking at a video up to age 1 and you're classifying temperament, and you didn't have any names of boys and girls, and sometimes it's hard to tell them apart if just you're looking to face up. Can adult observers distinguish boys and girls in infancy in terms of their level of difficult temperament and aggression? No, not very well. When does the boy-girl difference in externalizing behavior start? Ages 3 and 4. Because it's by 3 and 4 that the girls have skyrocketed ahead of boys verbally. And now we know from brain imaging studies, girls' brain development by the ripe old age of 2.5, 3, and 4 far outpaces boys. And there might be different socialization pressures for girls to be raised to be more nurturing than boys. It's cool to kind of be an all-boy. So it's a combination of biology and social shaping. But when do girls start to catch up? In the teen years. Never as violent as boys, but this adolescent onset group includes almost as many girls as boys. So girls are just as hungry for independence and maturity during the teen years, and lots of antisocial behavior goes up. What about racially? This exemplifies what we talked about in some of our chalk talk in the earlier lectures. Do certain ethnic groups have higher rates of antisocial behavior in the United States? Yes, African-American boys in particular, Latinos too, but what's also true of these ethnic groups? They tend to, on average, be poorer. Which is the spurious risk factor, and which seems to be the real risk factor? If you take into account social class and poverty, the black-white differences in aggressive behavior vanish to nothing. So it's not that black kids are inherently more violent, it's that black kids in our country tend to grow up in harsher circumstances, and it's those circumstances that are much stronger predictors of later aggressive behavior. Let's look again at risk factors for the early onset group. Moffat used to call them the life course persistent group, but not everybody persists. I'm not going to read them all, but I said them a minute ago, and this is a list of, what is that, 15 or 17 out of about 100 that are known. What do you think of when you read that list? This is a lot of bad stuff. It's a lot of bad stuff. Biologically, it's a lot of bad stuff in early parent-child relationships, later parent-child relationships, cognitively, school, peers. One of the problems in developmental psychopathology is, how the heck do you figure out which of these is the most important risk factor? Because we're still not allowed to randomly assign kids to live in coercive homes. We're still not allowed to randomly assign kids to get abused, obviously. It's unethical. So what you have is, for this early starter group, starting at about age 1, all these risk factors piling up over time, and we know that each one of them is a risk factor. Some may be spurious. But which one or which ones were the more primary? Which ones earlier in development led to a cascade of the others? And this is our problem. We're a very descriptive science right now. We know all these are risk factors for antisocial behavior, but we still don't really know very well which ones we should work on the earliest preventively. Which are the most malleable? Any thoughts as you look at this list? If you were devising prevention programs, we'll talk about prevention at the very end of the course, which risk factor or factors would you start with? Yeah. Age of the parent. The single biggest risk factor. So what would you do? Sex education in health class in 10th grade? I don't know how effective that is. Patches for girls below a certain social class? Now it gets controversial. What do we do preventively that doesn't invoke social control and isn't racist to say, I mean, the rates of teenage parenting in the United States are way down from 20 years ago, but they're still the highest in any country in the world. So what do we do? It's a huge issue. That's where a lot of prevention efforts are directed, but you get into religious debates and ethical debates and political debates and all kinds of things. Who else? Who has got a place to start here? Yeah. So yeah, what about abortion? One of the ideas, if you read the book Freakonomics, this is prominently displayed behind the fact that delinquency in boys has gone down pretty steadily for the last 15 years is, if you look when Roe versus Wade came into play and then look at ages, et cetera, the rates of teenage boys' delinquency and antisocial behavior began to go down, maybe as a function of Roe versus Wade and more legalized abortion. Now, there's a million other factors too, and it's very controversial, but that would be a prevention strategy. Over here. I missed what kind of education? And what kind of education? Family or cognitive for the kids, or what are you thinking about? So maybe if we could eliminate the so-called achievement gap, where poorer kids are behind academically from a very early age, and give them some of those verbal skills, really do what Head Start's supposed to do, maybe that would prevent 10, 15 years later delinquent behavior. This is one of the biggest effects of Head Start. Head Start boosts your IQ scores a little bit, and those gains fade after 2 years. But 15 years later, one of the biggest gains of Head Start is prevention of delinquency. So it's a very good idea. Anybody else? Right here. Therapist, or do you do it in groups? I mean, I'm a little kid, first grade, a Shrink's telling me how to make friends. I'm saying, yeah, right, Shrink, I believe this. But what happens if you get the kids in a peer group with other aggressive kids? Well, they learn more aggressive behavior. The contagion effect. So this is a big issue as to how you would prevent peer rejection. You had one too. Sure. So what about parenting? Can you help parents become more authoritative, less authoritarian, less permissive? Yes, but it's hard to do in mass education. It takes a lot of work, many months of parenting classes. Right here. So you're going to the neighborhood, fix those broken windows, have neighborhoods be more nurturing and protective rather than modeling violence. And excellent. Yeah, right here. What's the murder rate in the UK versus the US? Far lower. The police carry billy sticks. They don't have guns. There's gun control. Maybe we should do much more prevention at a weapons level and forget all the psychological stuff. So this is what a multiple levels of analysis does. You can pick from early genetic screening all the way to gun control and everything in between. This is where the debates get heavy. So we got to move along. There's too many risk factors. It's confusing. It's chaotic. What do we know? Cumulative risk. If you've got the early insecure attachment and the difficult temperament and ADHD symptom and peer rejection, all of those tend to accumulate and cascade over time. Also, this is another plug for developmental psychopathology. Just studying each risk factor in isolation causes us to miss what? The reciprocal and transactional nature of all this. So here's some examples of why interactive risk works. So in the same Dunedin sample, Moffitt found that the kids back at age 3 and 5 who scored low on their verbal intelligence, and they had families with a lot of mental illness or a lot of difficult parenting, if you put those two risk factors together, the risk for delinquency many years later went up by about a factor of 3. So it's not just poor verbal processing. It's not just family adversity. It's the two together. Now here's an even more provocative example. Adrian Raines, a colleague of ours, he's been at several universities, at University of Pennsylvania now, really interesting biological psychologist looking at the roots of antisocial behavior. Some years ago, he looked at data sets over in Europe where they've got national registries, and the island of Mauritius off the coast of Africa where they've got a national registry of every kid born there, and devised 2 risk profiles. One was, were you born with physical complications? Were you born at low birth weight? Did they have to use forceps? Was there a lot of birth trauma? The second one was a psychological trauma profile in your first year of life. Did your parents try to abort you but not succeed? Did they give you up for adoption before you were a month old? Or were you mistreated, abused before age 1? The physical birth complications predicted antisocial behavior 25 years later a little. The psychological, terrible early rejection predicted antisocial behavior 25 years later a little. What if you had both? It predicted it a lot. Early biological risk, I mean at birth, and early rejection, I mean in the first few months of life, it's the combination of the two. This is a developmental psychopathology thing you now know about from gene-environment interactions. These aren't genes. It takes probably early physical vulnerability and early psychological vulnerability. Put those two together and the risk goes way up. Question? Well, he said, I'm looking at factors only that first year of life. Now, of course, there were many things in between age 1 and age 25 that ensued, but he's saying, I'm going to look at the earliest risk factors I can get, and it was only the combination that mattered. We talked about, of course, and read the serotonin transporter gene by life event or maltreatment interaction. The first Caspi paper was a year before that. This was the MAOA gene, 2 alleles. The 1 allele makes you have a little bit less neurotransmitters flowing in your brain. If you've got that risky allele and you were maltreated in the first 10 years of your life, that upped the ante for delinquency and antisocial behavior much more than either risk factor alone. Another gene-environment interaction. What if your girls, another study they did in Dunedin, they looked at girls who went to public schools or to private all-girls schools. Was early puberty, the girls who were early matures physically, was that a risk factor for delinquency a few years later? Yes, for whom? The girls who went to co-ed schools, not for girls who went to all-girls schools. If you went to a co-ed school, you were hit on by the guys. So the early puberty alone didn't matter. It was the early puberty interacting with your social context of guys leering at you and encouraging you to get into antisocial behavior early. Pretty interesting. Now, what about in adulthood? We're going to go over this super quickly. Are there some adults who grow up and have these early starter pathways, and they're really not just in jail, but they're antisocial? So in adults, we say there's antisocial personality disorder. You have to have had conduct disorder as a kid or teen, and you have to continue with it. That's how you get this diagnosis. Then there's this thing called psychopathic traits. Psychopathic traits are, interesting evolutionary story here, why would they have survived? You're a guy in particular, and you're pretty charming, you're pretty glib, you do something wrong, you don't give a shit unless you get caught. Very low remorse, right? This describes certain politicians, certain attorneys, certain actors, but what if you've got those psychopathic traits and you've got other risk factors for antisocial behavior? So, we don't need to know this for the test, but you could have a lot of antisocial behavior and have these psychopathic traits. This is the subset of adult criminals that's very hard to rehabilitate. Most people in jail, however, have a lot of antisocial behavior, but they're not necessarily very psychopathic. That's the majority of people in jail. You could have very low antisocial behavior, but have high psychopathic traits. Name your politician, right? Isn't it? It's adaptive. You can lie without caring and get away with a lot of stuff, white-collar crime. And, quote, the normal variant is you're not terribly aggressive and you don't have very many of those psychopathic traits. But it's an interesting way to think about it. And if you're interested in the topic, there's a lot of research these days on what these high psychopathic traits are. Do they involve, when you're very young, something in your nervous system that makes it hard for you to respond to punishment? Most kids, they see that dirty look in that glare in their parents' eye. Okay, I better back off. What if you don't care? What if you don't really condition to those negative cues very well? Maybe that's the beginning of psychopathic traits. Girls, again, versus boys. Boys seem better at physical aggression. Girls seem better at relational aggression. But girls can get very physically aggressive, and boys are pretty good excluders, too. Back to the Moffitt, early starters, life course persistent, although life course persistent isn't always true, as we talked about. In that group, it's at least 5 or 6 or 7 to 1 boys to girls. But for the adolescent onset group, it's only about 1.3 to 1 boys to girls. Girls catch up, mimic, model, and show a lot of antisocial behavior in adolescence, but never as violent as boys. If you're a girl, the rare girl with the child onset, or the girl with a pretty severe adolescent onset, what happens? More than boys, you tend to have comorbid internalizing problems, because girls in general do. And maybe girls who are antisocial feel the consequences more. Depression, suicidality, difficult history of relationships, sometimes abusive relationships, bodily internalizing problems. So we've got a couple more slides on causes and treatments. We don't have as much next time on substance abuse. So we'll start off next time with a little bit more antisocial behavior and then get into substance abuse. We'll see you then.